All right, folks, part 2 from chapter 9. A bit more about evidence. By the way, we're going to have a lot of this, so try to keep it all together. Take a look. Evidence got to be relevant, material, and it has to be competent. So at the end of the day, you got to remember what we're looking for are things that can prove this intent that we're looking for. Okay? And notice it has to be authenticated. Now, what they mean by this is that when you have evidence, the question becomes, where did it come from? Is it reliable? Is it verifiable? Okay, so it's got to be relevant, verifiable, and valid. It has to be all three of those. And you have to be, once it's been authenticated, notice unaltered. This is particularly important with computer files. You know, back in the day, years ago, people used to try to fake documents by using a copier and changing numbers and things like this. Nowadays, it's much easier to do when you can do it online with the computer and much more difficult to catch. We also have to make sure that once we have this evidence, that the integrity of the evidence is maintained. I'm sure you've all seen the shows on TV where they talk about, the police shows where they talk about chain of custody. Could anybody have been involved in altering the evidence in any way? And again, that comes into play. This is where those lawyers become very handy to us accountants, because knowing the law, there's certain things, there's certain rules regarding these different types of evidence. Okay, notice unaltered from its original condition. You know, it could even have fingerprints and things like this on it. You have to be very careful. You're handling papers that could have fingerprints on them. How do you handle them appropriately? Chain of custody, making sure that that chain is not broken, that it's verified, that, in other words, that there was no outside influence trying to, influence this evidence, and that when it's stored, there's limited access. Not everybody can get to it, okay? So, and again, evidence is crucial. Remember, without it, we can have no intent of fraud, okay? On this particular slide, what they're talking about is, when does fraud occur? It's, and notice here the very top line, they said it happens in good times and in bad times. Typically what happens, not always, but typically, good times enable the fraudster. When things are going well and there's no reason to look for trouble, that's when fraudsters tend to do trouble. If a company is doing very, very well, what happens is their guard is down, and maybe they're not following all of the internal controls and things. And that's typically when the fraudster strikes, and when they think they can. So in good times, people aren't looking for trouble. And then when bad times roll around, usually that's when they start getting concerned. All of a sudden sales are down or whatever. They start looking at things more closely. So typically notice, it's around both times. In good times, it's generally easier to execute. And in bad times, that's usually when they come to the surface, okay? And generally this is because people are paying attention. Okay. When things are good, people are just rolling with it. And then when things start to go south, they start to look for all the reasons. And that's how this happens. Okay. Now, when you're looking at the evidence and you're like, okay, it's got to be relevant, it's got to be reliable, it's got to be valid. How do we do that? Well, here's the definitions. Now, relevance, I think everybody understands, as we mentioned before, it's whether or not it's going to make a difference. Reliability is, how strong is this evidence? Basically, it's about the source. Where did it come from? So, for example, if the information, say a bank record, it came from an outside third-party source, if you remember back from auditing, that's some of the strongest evidence. So this is coming from somebody outside the organization. So there would be no reason for them to do anything illegal to it, right? And then whether or not it's valid, whether or not it's true. So who did we get it from, and is it true? And basically there are some scales you use. So here's the first one for reliability. It's common scale, okay? And notice basically from A to D. And if we're putting together our case, we want the reliability to be unquestioned. Again, I think like a bank record. Something from a third party that has no interest in the case whatsoever, usually, or, even an individual that has no reason to be citing one way or another. And that goes all the way down to unknown. Now, believe me, if we're building a case, we want to be in this area. We want to be in the top area, okay? When you start going down here with evidence, you start to have trouble, okay? from a reliability standpoint. Now, from a validity standpoint, again, 1 through 4, we want 1. Notice the information has been corroborated. So to make it valid, what we hear, so let's say we had an individual that says a check was written for $10,000 to the Jones Company, right? And their belief was that it was an inappropriate payment. Well, corroboration would be information from the Jones Company that they did receive the $10,000. Now, as to whether or not it was for the incorrect purpose is another part of the story. But corroborating that it actually occurred, there you go. So that's confirmed. So confirmed and probable. You get down here doubtful, like it's inconsistent or cannot be evaluated. Evidence that cannot be evaluated is really of no worth. There's nothing you can do with it. Okay? Now, work papers. So the idea here is kind of like work papers. It's thinking back like an audit, where you had to verify everything that you do. By the way, in this class, we're going to use a software called IDEA. Okay? And they use this for auditing as well, but we're going to use it to analyze some records. Okay? So typically, to try to do this manually is, well, first of all, it's very challenging either way, but it's extremely challenging to try to do it manually. So IDEA helps us pick out these things. So what you have to keep in mind is these work papers, or these items you're putting together, they're going to come up in a court of law, and the attorneys for the other side are going to try to poke holes in what you did. Okay? So you got to be on top of everything. It's got to be typed, got to be no holes. You got to have everything documented. It's got to have been verified. It has to be relevant. It has to be reliable. You have to have everything documented. You have to make sure that it couldn't be altered in any way, like we looked at before. Chain of custody was kept. When it was stored, it was kept properly. Okay, it's a pretty big thing, because otherwise it can get thrown out in court. Now, when you go to organize these, again, typically now there are software programs to do this now to assist. And like I said, we're going to use one. So notice you have to come up with a plan. And you have to obtain and inventory the records. But the records here being generally the evidence. Okay? Could be among other things, but largely the evidence. Okay? And you got to keep track of all this. There's going to be some templates, and again, this is where templates for financial records, notice manual or automated. By the way, if it's manual, it creates another problem. When you're manually inputting information, you have to double and triple check everything. I'm sure you guys have used an Excel spreadsheet and created an Excel spreadsheet, and you're like, why isn't this working? It should be right. Imagine doing that with thousands of transactions. Okay, the notion to try to have to put that all in there manually, just the amount of man hours is incredible, and that's why we tend to use the software. Okay, then once we have all this data, then we start to pick through it and analyze it for leads. Okay, here we go. Analyze it for leads. Okay. So what do? How do you start with analyzing it for leads? Well, we'll see that when we use the IDEA software. But notice you can analyze by a number of things: by date, by payees, by deposit amounts, disbursement amounts. So all of a sudden, you could look, amounts over 10,000, amounts over 1,000, people with only one check, people with multiple checks. So you can kind of slice and dice the information to try to narrow down what it is you're looking for. Maybe doing a query where you're taking a look at an unusual payees, or payees that, so for example, a company's constantly paying certain suppliers, certain this. So what you might want to do is to run a query where you're looking for checks that are not normally written or not written in prior years to certain organizations. Okay? Okay? And what we're looking for is a pattern. Usually the pattern is the thing that's going to wind up putting us down that road of investigation. And again, we're looking at when they write checks, how they write checks. So like you can take a look at all these items here. Repetition of checks. Looking at the ebb and flow of monies. All right. So, these work papers, these are critical to what we're doing. They're critical in the courtroom, and they're critical to having them put properly together and to be able to analyze them to lead you in the right way. All right, folks, that's part 2 from Chapter 9. We're going to be back with part 3 in just a moment.